Hello and welcome to the Rights and Wrongs podcast. Today I'll be joined by social psychologist Dr. Tom Hatvany. We'll be talking about the idea of identity of self and those things that help create our identity. We will also be looking into social groups and how they try to influence our behaviors and thoughts, and along with how they do it without us knowing. We will be discussing these topics and more. I hope you enjoy, and thank you for listening to the Rights and Wrongs podcast. Welcome to the Rights and Wrongs podcast, the podcast we talk about rights, privileges, and misconceptions. Today I'm joined by Dr. Hatvany, and we're going to talk about identity of self and social groups. I will let him introduce himself and a little about himself. So thanks for joining me.
Well, my name is Dr. Thomas Hatvany. I am a faculty member here at Shippensburg University in Pennsylvania in the United States. I am a social psychologist by training, and I mainly study how different things sort of become incorporated into our identity or our self-concept, as we also refer to it. I have known George for a while. Actually, I originally knew George as Bones. I think that was the nickname we had for you.
I think yours was Chrome, if I'm not mistaken.
Crom, yeah.
Crom, yeah.
Yeah, so we both worked at a summer camp in New Hampshire when we were younger, and what was that, 2006, 2007, somewhere in that neighborhood.
I remember you and I both had a lot more hair.
Yes, we definitely did have a lot more hair back then.
Oh yeah, going back, we've known each other for a while, and now you're in Pennsylvania.
Yep.
And I'm in Scotland. So are they still counting votes over there, or is like the world still watching you?
So yeah, the world is still watching. Actually, about an hour before I started talking to you, there was a news article that came out that said that the state legislature has actually introduced a resolution to uncertify the election results and signed their own chosen electors, which is a little terrifying, effectively subverting the popular vote in the state. But we'll see how that turns out.
That is just frustrating. But
yeah,
weirdly, that fits in today's theme of identity and social groups. So one of the biggest missions of the Rights and Wrongs podcast is we try to defuse buzzwords because they like to use words a lot, and half the time they don't know what they are. You're in a very specific field, and I know there's at least one buzzword that you hate that you hear a lot that is widely misused. Do you want to explain to us what that is?
So there's a lot of what comes with attitude change and identity is a little bit sort of misconstrued. People are all the time trying to change each other's attitudes, like an election is. That's what all of those things are. And there's a big buzzword that comes up quite frequently called cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance sort of refers to this uncomfortable feeling we have when we have an incongruence between our behavior and an attitude, or between two attitudes. And that term refers to a very specific situation and it's very often misused, and that people sort of said, oh, someone had cognitive dissonance and therefore they changed their attitude or something like that. And the reality is that cognitive dissonance, that actual phenomenon, is very rare. It only happens in very specific situations. And so quite frequently people use terms because they learned about it somewhere, and the term is flexible enough that it can be used in the wrong situations incorrectly and not sort of shot down immediately. And then over time it just slowly gets misused to the point that even you'll see it misused in scientific literature.
I have experience from that. Someone making a mistake when you're doing research and you have to keep going back, and that's just but it's also kind of sad. I was just, while you were talking and explaining it again, it just kind of popped in my head. People can kind of use that as a bad tool as well, thinking about like, oh, if someone actually changed their mind on their own, they're like, oh no, you didn't change your mind, I changed it for you, kind of. That's a weird power trip if you think about it.
Yeah, so one of the things we definitely know about in the persuasion literature is that people really hate being told that they're going to be manipulated, or being manipulated, or being told that someone's going to try to change their opinions. Quickest way to prevent someone from actually changing their opinion by saying that, like, oh, we're going to have a conversation, I'm going to try to convince you of this. Everything shuts down. You can't ever have those situations where you're telling someone that you're going to try to convince them of something and they'll actually believe you. I don't know if you remember, but there's a while back, Facebook was doing some A/B testing, which is really just presenting two different options. And they presented two different options after the United States Supreme Court legalized gay marriage. And they presented two different options to put a gay pride flag behind your profile picture. And the word got out that Facebook presented these two different options to see which one would get people to click more. And people got really upset about that. Not the fact that they, chose to put the flag up or anything like that, but that Facebook did something to try to increase engagement to get people to do that. And so anytime sort of someone, feels like they've done something not of their own choice, they get very upset very, very quickly.
that's crazy to think about too. There's a lot of research out there. I've been listening about like similar things with YouTube algorithms because you start at YouTube and they'll keep pushing this. And there's some arguments depending on certain groups like that YouTube, if you watch a certain amount of something that YouTube doesn't want you to watch, they'll kind of force you to watch something else.
Mhm.
But at the same time, if you watch something that's like they approve of, they keep kind of pushing you down this. I never even thought about using like that as conditioning people, but just through content on the internet.
Yeah. So just so you know, Facebook is the #1 employer of social psychologists in the world. So they have lots of people who study the same kind of stuff that I study. Their job is to try to maximize interaction with their platform. And whether or not that platform is, YouTube or some other platform, they're constantly trying to study how people engage and what they're most likely to engage with. And while they're studying this, they're purely studying this from a standpoint of how do we maximize clicks, not necessarily trying to understand why this is happening or the ramifications or anything like that surrounding those things. And it's a little terrifying because our lives are so intertwined with those things right now. And effectively our identities are becoming a part of this, larger action by different online entities.
Social justice warriors come to mind too, but that's where it comes in with the whole entire idea of identity, where as always, I talked to my guests beforehand and we had a long conversation about this, but you really went into deep about how we kind of have this tribal mindset, which is a natural phenomenon in psychology, especially with social groups. And it's something that's very interesting to see develop and terrifying at the same time, not like trying to push any specific thing when it comes to politics. How do you, if you don't mind, do you think that this played more or less of a role in this current election than usual?
Well, so let me just back up a little bit and just talk briefly about how important groups are to us as humans.
Okay, that's perfect too.
As our species is one of a small group of species that is 100% dependent on other people. If you look at us, right, we're kind of useless, right? We can't run very fast. We're not particularly strong. Tons of other species have a lot of other things going for them that we don't. And everyone points to our opposable thumbs, but, squirrels do pretty good picking up nuts without opposable thumbs. And so we have a lot of things going for us, but other species have a lot of other things going for them. And so the one thing that really does set us apart is our ability to interact with other people and work as a group. And there's a few other species that do that very effectively, but our species is the only one that does that with people that we're not genetically related to. And that's as far as we know. Obviously, there's a possibility that there's some species somewhere that does it that we're not aware of, but we do it very well, and it's sort of very hardwired into us. Now, a lot of people may argue that this concept of being hardwired and things like that doesn't really exist, but I can guarantee you that every single person on the planet at some level wants some kind of social interaction, even if they are scared of social interactions. They, at some level, want to be able to interact with other people and work with other people. And so we have this very strong drive as a species to interact and belong to groups and participate and contribute to our own welfare, but through the welfare of a group or some other larger group. That is pretty well found, right? There's no really any arguments against that anywhere in the literature. That seems to be a pretty common theme, and no one's found any evidence that I'm aware of that shows that we don't do that as a species. And so because of this drive, right, we're constantly trying to make sure that we are connected to other people and we are accepted by other people at some level. And if you think about it, that's a pretty important sort of survival mechanism, right? If we don't have other people around us, we're likely to not be able to provide food for ourselves. We're likely not to be able to reproduce. We're likely not to be able to defend ourselves against other people as well as other species, but mainly other people. And so we need these groups. And the stronger these groups are, and the more included by these groups that we are, the better our, for lack of a better word, self-esteem is, right? And so in social psychology, we think of self-esteem slightly differently than the rest of psychology. Self-esteem is usually thought of as sort of self-worth and how much we value ourselves. In social psychology, we tend to think of self-esteem more as a barometer of how much other people are accepting of us. And that becomes pretty important because if we're not accepted, right, if the group doesn't want us, we quickly get rejected, and we don't want to be rejected. We don't want to be in the position where the group is no longer supporting us. And so we quite frequently will engage in behaviors to make sure that the group accepts us and continues to accept us. And that in some situations results in people engaging in some extremely extreme group behaviors. In some situations, engaging in violence to support their group or the group that they belong to. In other situations just becoming more and more like the group. And this in turn actually sort of creates a little bit of a spiral effect in that other people will see other individuals doing that, and they'll continue to do that over and over again. And so if you take any sort of situation, whether it's an election or a brawl after a sports game, right, all of these things are sort of part of these group dynamics where an individual is just expressing their belongingness to the group, and other people will see that and continue to do that. And again, it will sort of spiral in that direction.
There's a lot there.
Yeah,
I'm not really sure. But it's important to get that background because there's just so much in there. I was just thinking back to how we talk about like identity of self in different groups. And it is interesting too, because we're kind of very one-dimensional when it comes to communication in the United States, or I should say two-dimensional, where it's that person's a Democrat or a liberal, that person's a firefighter, or that like people identify, like, even though there's thousands of different things that you can identify yourself, I'm sure you can think of 20 different things that make you, but we kind of focus on one. And it's very interesting because if you are that one thing, some people think they have to be farther more into that one thing, or people looking at you because you're that one thing, they assume that's all you are. Two examples I can think of is like when I got out of the military, I'm like, I'm a veteran, therefore I need to get my gun license, I need to drive a pickup truck, and I guess I'm now a Republican. And it was just, but that's not true. Like because my moralities didn't change. So like I realized I am far more liberal on beliefs like that. I don't really need a pickup truck. I need 4-wheel drive because I was still living in Boston. But there's some interesting things like that. And there's other points, like just because you like one certain thing, like people find it strange if you go into a rock bar. You might be able to walk into a rock bar and talk about science fiction with the people. Like just because they have that one interest doesn't mean that's all they are. And I think that's an important thing to look at, especially nowadays.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we all have different aspects of ourselves, right? So I specifically, when it comes to what I study how a goal becomes a part of who we are. So we all have different goals in our lives, and some of those goals are very sort of central to what we do, and some of them are not. We've effectively found that this principle seems to hold true in a lot of other areas, right? So our significant others, the groups we belong to, the values that we may hold, the things that we like, the books we read, the brands that we buy, the religious groups that we belong to, all of those different things at some level are going to become a part of who we are. And it's going to be a mix of all of those things that define our identity. However, some of those things are going to be things that we want to display to other people. Some of those things are not going to be things that we want to display to other people. Some of those things are going to be the things that we are reinforced with from group membership. And some of those things are going to be things that we want to display to others because those are sort of central to us, and we want to sort of show that we are different and show that we are distinct in certain situations. And so our what we include in our identity becomes this huge sort of center point of our motivation and what we want to pursue. And if that's a part of what we are, we sort of feel like we have to match those things. And like you said, right, you sort of felt like you had to do certain things because of those aspects of your identity, but there was other aspects of your identity that just didn't match those things. And at some level, you sort of felt the need to do those things despite not actually wanting to do those things just because of that identity.
And I guess that kind of is just peer pressuring and like other things. And like you just get into this area and you think you have to be that. That's, if anyone's listening to the episode that just aired on the 27th, we talked a lot about this with veterans and like how this actually hurts veterans because they think they have to be this certain way, or a lot of people view them and might be scared of them for certain reasons, or think they align with certain political beliefs, and it's just kind of like they're more than one person, or there's intersectionality of dealing with issues. I know I talk about vets a lot, but that's just something I understand with split and duality in these situations. The one question I was going to ask, though, do you think that, I try not to get too much into the political realm like this past election, but it seems like a lot of people stuck to their guns on both sides. And there's this weird aspect when it comes to social groups where someone will come to a conclusion that I'm going to vote for this person, or I believe in this issue. And even if they're presented evidence that like, okay, that might not be the best option for you, or you ask them why they presented and they can't give an option, they just kind of get entrenched in the, do you have any insights in that? Or
so one thing that we have sort of seen in some of the literature is that there are certain behaviors that we engage in once we sort of become a member of the group. And when we're part of a group, we engage in certain behaviors where we clearly identify with the group and we agree with the group and we go along with the group. We say like, we're doing this and we're doing that, even if you're like tangentially connected to those groups. So the number of times that people say, my president or our group is winning, we won this election, those kinds of things. Those are pretty strong behaviors. And what we've found is that the more connected these different identities are to our self-concept, and so we use the term fusion. So the more fused someone is with a particular group or identity, the more likely they're to engage in some of those extreme behaviors related to the group. And so the less likely they are to abandon the group when the group doesn't do well, right? So when we see people on both sides, in the last 4 years, both sides have lost in the United States, if you will. You see people sort of become very entrenched and very loyal to their groups. You see people, not my president type things on both sides when things don't go their way because of how connected and how closely intertwined their identity is to these different sides, right? If you're on a side that loses, you're going to stay there just to show loyalty as well as demonstrate that you are a part of that group, and vice versa. So when the other side loses, right, you quite often engage in behaviors that are not necessarily pleasant, but maybe, if you go right now, the number of things from the left that are saying, you lost, stop being a sore loser, all of those things. But that's exactly what happened in the other direction 4 years ago. So we see these behaviors of just supporting your group over anything else, because that's of how central that group is to your identity.
And I always have mixed feelings about this too when it comes to people following things to identity. I always find it interesting to find if you and I have the same belief, I find it interesting to come out like how the journey is, because I think there's a huge misconception when it comes to people thinking, oh, we both believe in a political belief, therefore we must come from the same journey. It's like there's multiple different ways to arrive at that, and sometimes it doesn't matter on issues. Like I know one instance where I was talking to a couple friends and they were arguing. I'm not going to use names, but it came to an issue of like sexuality, and one believed it was a choice, another person believed it was what they were born into. And I know this is like a huge thing, but at the end of the day, like both of them were perfectly okay with it, and they were both pro gay marriage and pro all that. And I'm like, okay, at that point, like the journey doesn't matter so much at that point. What matters at that point is like you guys agree. And then other issues, you'll come to people and they'll have a belief on something. Some people get a little crazy because like I'm pro Second Amendment, I'm pro gun, but I'm also pro firearm control. And people don't think those correlate, but it's like if you come to why I believe you should have a right to a gun, it's not the same as a guy running a militia. And I think they just see that I'm pro Second Amendment, that I have hold their same beliefs. And it's interesting how sometimes the journey doesn't matter, but other times I think it does. Do you have any?
There's a few theories within social psychology that try to explain that specifically. One theory that's sort of been done away with because it has some issues, particularly when you get into sort of more than 3 individuals. Called balance theory. Balance theory is actually a relatively simplistic concept, but it doesn't really work in the aggregate. It doesn't really work when you sort of expand it and make it more complex. But the theory at least tries to suggest that if I like something and that thing is also liked by you, I'm going to have a positive reaction to you so that everything's sort of in balance. Same sort of thing when you have an individual. Like if you like an individual and that individual likes something that you hate, right, that's out of balance. Something has to change there to balance things out. And it's actually kind of in line with this idea of cognitive dissonance that I mentioned earlier. But like I said, it doesn't really work out in a lot of complex sort of situations. So for example, this doesn't really work too much for me anymore, but I'm from Boston. Both of us are from Boston, and Tom Brady is a big deal to people in Boston. And there's a period of time where people sort of still viewed Tom Brady very positively, even though it was very clear that he potentially liked a political candidate that a lot of other individuals didn't. And yet those things didn't change. They didn't fall out of bounds. So there's been some theories that have been put forward to try to explain exactly what you're talking about. People sort of identify with something, and therefore, if you like that, I must like you, and those things. The reality is that's a very surface level thing, and it definitely falls apart very quickly. There's another theory that relates to that called implicit egotism, which effectively, if you put some people in a room and you have them all express some very basic information about themselves, anywhere where that information sort of lines up, those individuals are more likely to start to try to have an interaction with each other because, oh, you have something in common with me. Let's go try to interact with each other. The reality is those, if I just know that we happen to have the same birthday or the same initials, that's not going to make us friends, but it is going to sort of start that initial interaction. So you may be able to, have a dialogue with someone in a militia because you're pro Second Amendment, but how long until that dialogue breaks down because you clearly see things differently, right? And unfortunately, that can actually lead to some backlash at some situations because they see you as almost a traitor, which is almost worse in some situations. They see you as a black sheep. You're with us, you get our ideas, but you're not us and you're not supporting our ideas. So it's almost worse in some situations.
I just find that like being a political moderate is a lot the same way, because I'll have some friends that are diehard conservatives, and I'm like, I hold some and I understand some of their views and beliefs, and I have friends that are liberals and I believe in them. Like I believe in socialism, I believe in nationalized healthcare, but I do understand when people get a little with America's history. I understand when like some conservatives are cautious of federal oversight and federal like doing whatever they want, because we have things like the Tuskegee experiments and a few other things that our government has not been the nicest to people. And it's interesting too, because you talk about that, and when it comes to certain groups, I don't think a lot of people understand, if you ever try to walk the line, no one sees you as a potential bridge or ally. They just see you as, you're halfway to my side, I need to pull you fully. So you just end up being a rope. And that's where I see a lot of my friends that were moderates like me just tend to like lean one way or the other, just because it's such an argument of,
yeah, they either feel the need to pull you entirely to your side, or they see you as a traitor or someone that doesn't actually fit your values and therefore needs to be ostracized or completely separated from the group. And I think we can all see that on all these different sides right now, where, an individual, voices some sort of moderate opinion, and one of the sides decides that not acceptable, and we need to get rid of you. Like I said, we've seen this on both sides. We have examples of that in the Trump administrations, where people were seen as very loyal and then seen as, you did this one thing and we're going to push you out. And we see that on the left as well, with all sorts of social issues as well, where, someone, again, voices a moderate opinion and is pushed out as well. Now, are there situations where those opinions potentially are wrong? Yeah, of course. But are there situations where they're just kind of a moderate, normal opinion and they're being completely rejected by one side or the other? Yes, there's plenty of those. And that is perfectly in line with what we'd expect to see from human behavior, in that if you are a member of our group, but you are seen as a traitor to the group, we don't want you anymore. And you're worse than our enemy. You're disloyal, and we honestly even respect people on the other side because at least they're loyal to their side. It's very expected from what we know about human behavior to see that.
It's also really interesting to talk about that too, because you have that tribal mindset in a lot of political issues. And it is strange too, because I think people should speak out and not be afraid. For I thought I was going to be ostracized and seen as a traitor by a lot of people, because I'm very vocal about not liking the veteran preference in law enforcement hiring in the United States. And when I talk about that, it's amazing how many veterans come up to me and they're like, yeah, I felt the same way, so it is interesting when you do have the out sheep, because I think a lot of us are more in that middle ground, but we just feel like we have to, for our own protection, be in a certain label. And
you can't do anything to reject your own group, right? And so you have to sort of continue to side with your group, even when your group is potentially making a decision that's not correct or not necessarily in line with your values. And when you do stand up to that, right, what is your group going to say about you? They're probably not going to accept you, because that doesn't fall in line with what makes their group or makes that particular identity work for them. Again, on the other side, right, they're going to see, oh yeah, you're agreeing with us, but all these other things that you agree with, and you end up losing a group entirely. And so the motivation to stay with your group, even if your group is slightly wrong, right, is pretty high, because you've effectively lost a group entirely if you sort of speak out against your own group.
So from your field, I'm guessing the two-party system of the United States, and I know we have hundreds of parties technically, but the real two parties must be fascinating and terrifying.
I think it's fascinating because we can clearly see like a lot of clear group behaviors that we'd expect and be able to predict ahead of time. They never really cease to follow those lines, right? They definitely continue to express it. I would caution the word party, because it quite frequently tends to be more than just the party membership. And it tends to be more whether or not someone aligns ideologically on one side or the other than it is the actual party membership. And in fact, I would argue that there's lots of people who are actually members of other political parties in the United States, third parties or independents, that see themselves as one of these two major party groups. Now, is it terrifying? I think it's terrifying because in a lot of situations we can predict, lots of struggle and lack of compromise between those two groups. So that's a little scary. I think, though, that a situation with less two major powerful parties, but more lots of division, no anywhere close to being a majority, is actually a little bit more terrifying, because at least it's basic and simple to understand where people stand ideologically. And if you had lots and lots of different ideological groups, becomes a little bit more difficult. Unfortunately, the real solution in my mind, the unfrightening situation is where there's no groups. But that's, I don't think, going to happen with human behavior.
I just thought of like three different examples we were talking about with politics. So the first one where you have no parties or groups, basically Parliament would be the third Pirates of the Caribbean, where everyone's just voting for themselves. We'd have that. It is interesting too with multiple groups because you have situations like where I see more than two political parties and groups work effectively, or places like Iceland and Israel, because I think there's 17 parties in Israel and there's multiple parties in Iceland. But because of the fact that no one holds a majority there, they have to make compromises and agreements with the other parties to get a push. And I feel like, so it'd be interesting when you follow some of the parties that when it comes to one political issue, they're allies with one other group, but they're enemies of the next. And the next political issue, because it's going on the same time, they're allies with the people that are enemies on the other issue, which I think is more interesting because it's more focused on the issues than the party. But then you can also have other situations where, like here in Scotland, all but I think two counties got the Scottish Nationalist Party in it. Like Scotland has a party that only cares about Scotland. And right now, that's kind of what Scotland needs, because as we would see with the COVID situation, argumentatively, England doesn't care about Scotland, so Scotland needs to care about Scotland. But it does create a problem where the two more influential and resource-powered parts of this union are at odds with each other in a lot of ways. And it can see where you're saying that. So it's interesting how there's potential for reward and danger at the same time.
Like the idea of, having a party just for a particular issue and being a member of that party for that issue, and then effectively, having an ally in this party for, the economy, but having an enemy in that party for medical related decisions, right? Those, I don't know if I think it seems like a very utopian idea to me. And I believe that it can work in certain situations, particularly when you have certain expectations of civility. However, I think you're going to have a lot of situations where certain issues become very, very ingrained in someone's identity. And so they're going to care about one issue over everything else. And when that happens, that's where you end up with a lot of like, well, I'm just going to block you on all these other things because I want this more than others. And we clearly saw that in this election in the United States, where there's clearly individuals who are voting based off of a single issue, right? Whether or not that issue is healthcare or abortion or the climate issues or student debt, right? There's people who are making their decisions pretty much based solely on a single issue that they care about very heavily. I seriously question whether or not people can be willing to compromise if they're engaging in these single issue debates that are so central to who they are and their identities.
Well, the one example I can think of, I had a few friends that were very active in the Massachusetts Libertarian Party. I'm not sure how fact this is. This is just coming from the infighting afterwards. But the Libertarian Party was huge when it came to the legalization of marijuana in Massachusetts. I'm sure you remember when that happened. Yeah. I remember I was in college. And they're like, great, okay, we focus on this issue. And my friends that were in it, they didn't really care for that issue, but they're like, okay, we've got a good steamroll on it. It's helping us gain members. We'll get this. And like everyone's going like, okay, we'll focus on this issue. And then later they wanted to focus on, I think, getting cheaper or like more regulations on pharmaceutical companies to keep prices down. But the second that a lot of the people got their legalized weed, that's all they focused on. They became what you're talking about, a very focused on one issue party. It's like, we already won that issue. Can we please move on to the next? Yeah.
And then a lot of individuals who were there were probably like, well, you're not really part of us, the newcomers, right? That's a very common phenomenon that you see, that like the new people to town or the new people to the organization. And even, ending up with, party loyalists who sort of reject all of this new support because it's different from how they envision their own party or their own group. And they sort of feel like their group has been changed in a way that doesn't necessarily fit who they are. And so, even when you have situations where people are potentially developing allegiance, they're still sort of kept at arm's reach, right? They're kept away a little bit because they're seen as not necessarily loyal to the group, but they're seen as loyal to an issue. And that's actually not what the group wants. The group wants you to be loyal to the group, not loyal to an issue that the group believes in.
Which that makes things like a little, I can see that being a challenge with a lot of, and you're seeing that because we talk about American politics and everyone talks about the Democrats and Republicans, but both parties are very fractured. Yes. They're kind of parties within parties. Like you have the Bernie Sanders group within the Democrats. which I would call more the socialist Democrats. And then you have like the extreme Tea Party liners, and you have the Proud Boys, but you also have like there's all these different movements on both sides, some good, some bad, some I don't know what's going on. But so it isn't exactly two-lined either.
And so actually you've seen this pretty much any time any party has had a like full control over both houses in the White House, is that certain things are not even able to get pushed through because even within that party, there's a reasonable amount of division, right? Like the one thing that like Obama can really claim is healthcare, right? And all the other initiatives that he has and spoke about, he didn't even get enough support from his own party to push those things through. And again, with Trump, you see the same sort of things where there were definitely things that he proposed, and yet people from his own party didn't necessarily fully agree. They didn't vote in and we hear about those situations where they do vote in a block quite frequently, but they're actually exceedingly rare. Both a party as a whole votes entirely as a block. And it usually requires some sort of strong leadership, and it usually requires substantial negotiation within that own party to make that happen. And, that's why we see, presidents outlining these huge agendas and very few of those things actually getting pushed through in a timely manner. And that's why we see, the first 100 days as being so important for a presidency, because that's the one point in time in a presidency where they can really make those compromises with people within their own party because they're not necessarily worried about getting reelected yet. And as soon as those things start happening, they start going down their own individual ideologies and they end up fracturing apart. And so that's why I sort of say that it's not necessarily party loyalty, but it's ideological loyalty and identity, because these individual parties, where they might stand for one side of the ideological spectrum, or at least somewhat in that direction, they are still fractured at the same time, because these underlying identities to different ideologies are really what people tend to be talking about, and not these large, complex, I'm a Republican identities, but I am anti-abortion, or I am anti-vaccine, or I am pro climate neutrality, or whatever the issue is. That is really what people seem to be claiming or latching on to.
What's also interesting too is it fascinates me how we kind of look at political parties as a group. I know we're focused on political parties a lot for social groups, but it's kind of we just had a major election. But it's great it's important how you talk about with the splitting and changing is most people look at the Democrats and Republicans as if they're ironclad things that happened since the beginning of the Constitution, which our founding fathers warned us against political parties. Like George Washington did it when he left afterwards. And I think John Adams even argued against it. I think there was even a few bills proposed to make them outlawed in certain states and stuff. But the interesting thing is the parties that had Democrats were actually from the same party. They were the Democratic Republicans that went against the Whigs, basically demolished the Whigs in Senate and all the elections. And then all of a sudden you had infighting to the point that they shattered into what we now know. And then during the Civil War, if you think about political views, I know people argue the polar switch. I know you probably know what I'm talking about. But the South was actually the Democrats and the North were the Republicans. Now the North are the Republicans and the South are Democrats. And some people argue that, the Democrats are still the same Democrats from before the Civil War, and the Republicans, there was a polar switch on a lot of issues.
Yeah, so I'm not a particular expert on whether those different ideologies and how those ideologies have changed over time, but it's definitely feasible that if you are sort of loyal to a party or a particular issue, those things will change over time, particularly over generations, right? And that's effectively what we're talking about, is generations of people changing sort of attitudes, trying to bring people to their side. And as demographics change and all of those things, you're going to see very different makeups of those things. And so if, one party believed in free trade, but now doesn't, and the other party does, right, there was probably a very intentional decision to do that. Over time, that changed for that particular group. And again, I think that really comes down to whether or not someone is identifying with a particular issue and not necessarily identifying with a particular party itself. And so I think people go, no, you're, a Republican, so you identify with Republican ideology, and you're a Democrat, so you identify with those kinds of things. I think it's more the ideology and sort of siding with people who also have that ideology than it is wearing the label of a particular political party. It's wearing the label of that particular belief.
So I'm going to try and get a little bit away from politics, and this is a political podcast. We've talked a lot about how people identify with being what their political spectrums are and beliefs and stuff like that. And obviously you have those things where people identify with their sex, gender, sexuality, occupation, location, which I'm going to get back to you on that. Do you feel like there's any part of our identity that like influences people that they never really notice, like a very overlooked
They don't
identity.
acknowledge.
Yeah.
I would say so. I think there are things that are central to our identities that we don't necessarily think of as being central to our identities unless we're asked about them, like point blank. Like there's clearly situations where there's things that are so vitally important to who we are that we really take those things for granted. I think the most basic example is our physical bodies, right? They're, we see our hands, our limbs, right, as part of who we are, but we don't necessarily go, my left foot really, defined my identity. At some level it does. It's sort of a part of who we are. And if we lose it, it's a very sort of traumatic sense of loss to who we are and our identity. And so I think there's plenty of things that sort of probably fall into that boat that are just very part of who we are. Whether or not they're things that we're like completely unaware of, they're like completely subconscious. I mean, that's a very sort of Freudian perspective. I don't know if that's
Tell me about
true.
your dreams.
Yeah. I would say that that's probably, it's something that we wouldn't necessarily be able to test well and examine. And so I'm not sure if that's even a road that like social psychology would go down. But I think it's an interesting thing to question about whether or not there's things that are central to our identity that we don't necessarily consider are part of our identity until we either lose them or we're questioned about them. And I would say that's probably present.
Which it's important. It's important that you brought up about the whole entire foot thing because of everything that's going on in the world, and I realize I am definitely a person of privilege, and I actually had to sit down and I was thinking about my privilege. One part of privilege that I don't think about relates exactly to that, which is able-bodiedness. I would never think of myself as being able-bodied, but if I lost a foot or an arm or anything that would impair me like that, disability would probably become part of my identity, but not being disabled never was part of my identity.
Yeah, but I would say that thing you lost was at some level a part of who you were, but you didn't necessarily, again, it was sort of very much taken for granted. But the feeling of what you experience when you lose it is the same feeling that you sort of experience when you lose something that's also part of who you are. So for example, let's say you are banned from playing a particular sport. You're a professional athlete and you're banned from playing that sport because of steroid use or whatever the reason is you're banned from playing, right? Losing that aspect of your identity is a huge sort of component, and not being able to continue that is a huge sense of loss, right? And when you see those same kind of things like the loss of a limb or something like that, you're experiencing the same kind of emotion. You're experiencing the same kind of sense of loss. And so you may not have considered it a part of your identity, but at some level it was. You experienced those things as being a part of you.
The one thing I was going to also ask is, how are you feeling? Because this is something I've realized. I'm not sure if you've noticed a lot. Maybe because you've moved from Massachusetts to Pennsylvania, you noticed this. I didn't realize location of self applied so much to self-identity as it did. I kind of noticed it when I was a northerner and I moved to the South. And I realized, like, I'm a moderate in Massachusetts, but they consider me a bleeding heart liberal in North Carolina. And moving here to the UK, I realized, they look at me and I say certain things and they're like, even our conservatives wouldn't think that, like the stuff that they hear that comes into America. And the reason I asked this is I did come across also another strange thing, which a huge part that we didn't really go over about identity is race. And I didn't realize race can change depending on your location. Like we kind of know, like if you listen to Trevor Noah from The Daily Show, he talks about how he went from, in the United States, he's black, but in South Africa, he's mulatto. And I have friends that are Mediterranean, which if they're in the United States, they'd be white. Like they're from Greece, they're from Cyprus, they're from Italy. But in the UK, they're not white. And when I sign up for job applications, it's not like in the US, it's like white non-Hispanic is an option. Here, it's literally white French, white German, white Irish, white British, white Scottish. Some even have white American, just because I don't want to check half the list. But I wasn't sure if there's a study on that within.
So salience definitely plays a big role in all of those things. I'm not familiar with a specific study, or at least one's not coming to mind right now. But there's definitely research on when certain aspects of your identity is more salient and you're more aware of those things. And those tend to be when you're in a situation where that aspect of your identity becomes unique wherever you are. And so, for example, my identity as a Boston sports fan definitely was more salient to me when I was in an environment that was not full of Boston sports fans. So I did my graduate work in Oklahoma at Oklahoma State University, and being a Patriots fan down there was definitely very salient because everyone hates the Patriots. And in those different environments, those identities become very salient. And so I know there is research within at least race where, being the only person of color in a group becomes very salient, becomes a very salient aspect of your identity. But if you're full of a group of other people with the same racial background, that identity is sort of no longer primed. It's no longer a salient aspect of one's identity. And so that, yeah, there's definitely a component to that. When it becomes unique, it becomes, you're very aware of it. And when it's no longer unique, it's different. And depending on where you are, right, if you're in a different country, those different things are categorized in different ways because they're either more salient for one reason or another.
That's the reason I just found it fascinating, just because it is strange living in the UK for many reasons, especially since it's a much older nation than the United States. Well, the colonized version of America is a baby. Nations much older that are in the United States. But the thing that just threw me off is there's 300 million people in the United States, and about half of them, I'm not sure about the demographics, are just white. That's just all we are. And then we come to a nation with a fraction of the population. And you would think that they've mingled a lot more than we have in the United States, but they haven't. And it's still very determined. I just found that fascinating and a little confusing at the same time.
And what you end up running into is situations where, when everyone within that group now has, and this is something I didn't really bring up earlier, but you end up with these situations where you want to be distinct within the group, but it's still the group, right? And so if you're in a group of all white people, right, what starts to become, the salient identities are those, next level down identities, right? What is your country of origin, right? Or where did you come from? Or those other little distinct things. You're still part of this group potentially, right? But you're still, I'm contributing here and I'm contributing here from this place and that place. You end up with these identities where you want to be like the group, but you also want to be slightly different and unique within that group, but you don't want to be different from the group. So you'll start aspects of your identity that still make you part of the group, but you want to be, unique, are going to sort of raise their heads, and they're sort of going to start to pop up. So, for example, if I'm in a group of people from the United States, right, I have my own background and heritage that's slightly different than most of the people in the room. And so those kinds of things may be more likely to come out. I have a different educational background. I have a different, sports team loyalties. All those things will sort of come up, but I'm not going to sort of oppose those underlying ideologies of the group that I'm a part of at the same time.
Which is also interesting coming from the United States, because people always ask, mainly because people in the United States don't ever really leave the United States, but people ask, where are you from? And I usually just say Boston, forgetting there's a Boston, England, but it's just I'm so ingrained in that. And oh, Boston where? Oh, Massachusetts. And then I realized, I am an American, but that's so far a part of my identity, but I'm American, but I'm so ingrained in where I'm from of a state, which is a very strange thing, because I think we look at our states as nations, even though they're that. And it's interesting how you talk about that, how you want to be part of a group, but also different. You see a lot in veteran culture, Marine Corps versus other vets, even though we're all technically veterans, or sports fans, because I can be a diehard hockey fan as I am, but I might get into an argument with a Canucks fan or a Maple Leafs fan because I'm a Bruins fan. And it's just very strange that we have a passion for the same sport, but there's just a difference of allegiance, and that's basically colors, and it can cause animosity.
Yeah. And so you actually bring up a really good point with Boston, right? Both of us quite frequently, and I'm sure other people from wherever they are, usually just, say, oh, I'm from this city or this town, right? And it's usually the closest major landmark, I'm from Arlington. I believe you're from Quincy, right? Mm-hmm. When we're talking about other people elsewhere, right, we tend to, talk about, I'm from Boston, right? Even though we're not technically from Boston, right? We're from these areas that are very close to it and areas where we effectively all get sort of grouped together. But when we're in Boston, right, I'm from Arlington, you're from Quincy, right? Well, those individual identities sort of come out, but you're still part of the group. You're still part of the Massachusetts, or the Boston area, right? But, we have these little identities underneath that within these separate little communities.
Yeah, and that's funny. Whenever you meet other Bostonians, you always ask, "Oh, what part are you from?" And they'll be oh, I'm from Lynn, or then you say the nursery rhyme, or you're I'm from Arlington, and but if someone says they're from Springfield, it's you're where dragons are. You're not from Boston. Yes. Or if you find out they're from your same city, I've met another Quincy person, oh, what part of Quincy? And then I have to say Houseneck, and they might say, so it is interesting because it's oh, you find a connection, but now we have to find a way to divide each other.
Yeah, right. Then those other individual identities start becoming more important to the conversation about who you are and trying to figure your identity out and them out at the same time. But again, you're not opposing each other at the same time, right? So all of the things that sort of make you loyal to like the Boston area and the things that go along with that, right, are not being opposed by those separate little identities. But those separate little identities aren't really important when you're talking to someone from North Carolina.
Yeah, that's true. Because it's just like if I find out someone else is from New England, like, cool, we like the Patriots. But if I find out you're from Quincy, I have to figure out which high school you went to, because now I have to figure out if I like you based off that football team.
Yes, yeah, exactly.
All right, so one thing I was going to do, I always leave a position for my guests that are watching live to ask a question. I was going to ask, is there anything that you feel that we didn't cover?
I think we, for the most part, sort of talked about how identities can be sort of lead to all of these different group behaviors, and where in some situations that is negative, right? When we see sort of decisions and infighting and things like that between groups and even within a group. I think that sort of always leads to this idea that these biases, if you will, are always negative things. And while there's plenty of biases out there that are almost always negative, a lot of these situations have positives and negatives, right? Being part of a group, gives us this the sense of identity, and the sense of identity is actually something that's very important to our mental health, right? If we don't have those senses of identity, we actually, start experiencing a lot of, negative health outcomes. And that actually may sort of explain why some of these things are so extreme right now, in that we at the same time that we're seeing these, extreme group identities, we're also seeing, a rise in mental health disorders. And so it is quite possible that those things are very heavily linked to each other. There's also a lot of positive things that come from these group identities, right? So a sense of identity is beneficial to all of us when it comes to, having these group loyalties, having a group of people that you can rely on. And so in a lot of situations, I'm sure you have experienced this yourself, is being able to rely on the person in your group is a very helpful thing, and a very useful thing. If we don't have those connections, we don't have that identity, those things don't really necessarily form. And so we look at these identities and we go, okay, this is a bad thing, right? And it's not always. And so it's very important to recognize that while we can have identities that are negative or have negative outcomes, we can also have identities that are very useful and very helpful to us. And it's not a matter of, being strongly identified with something is a bad thing, is the consequences that are downstream from those things. And so I think it's important to always recognize that things aren't purely bad and things aren't purely good either. They have their consequences.
All right, thank you. I don't see that we got any questions. I have two. I usually I should have asked you this before, but do you have any media or a book that you would recommend to the listeners?
So personally, if anyone is interested in any of my research, you can find me on my ResearchGate account, which I think George will link to this. You can find all of my research there. I'll be adding to that as time goes forward. And like I said, I am a faculty member at Shippensburg University. We have an online master's program that if people are interested in looking into, they're welcome to do that as well.
Right, perfect. Yeah, and I will attach your ResearchGate to when this posts, it will be part of the summary. Great. So I had that question, and another question just kind of popped since no one asked. Do you feel that COVID is going to affect people's social groups? Because I've noticed with myself, a lot of people, you have potential for two different things. One, I've now noticed for myself, I'm letting my hair grow out, which I normally wouldn't do because I'd be working security jobs, or now I'm drinking my craft beers and homemade coffee brews. I basically turned myself into what I used to consider a hipster, which I would have made fun of when I was an 18-year-old, but that's just self-growth. But I also feel like there's also a lot of potential because people don't get out. They're not getting judged by their groups, but when they're talking to people, there's echo chambers. And I wasn't sure what your opinion on that would be.
So a couple of things. First of all, clearly there's this concept of an echo chamber, right? So we didn't really touch on it, but there's a general idea called group polarization that, the more you talk to people within your groups, the more extreme your ideas about those things come. And I think just because of the interaction that we have, it's sort of limited to internet interactions, probably through social media or something of the like. I can imagine that happening just at a much higher rate. And so there may be an increase in extreme behaviors. I would have to see some data to show that or demonstrate that, but I can imagine it happening. I would also say that I think quite frequently we have this belief that we are the person that we're going to be for the rest of our life. And so Daniel Gilbert, who's a psychologist at Harvard, writes a lot about this, that we think that we're the person we're going to be for the rest of our life. And that's just not the case. We're always changing, and we change throughout until the end of our lives. And there may be traits that don't really change, but we always change as who we change our identities and change our just aspects of who we are. I think is going to be very striking is that I think a lot of that change is happening in a more isolated environment. And so we're going to see people who are changing in their own ways, but they're not changing because of some of these group interactions that we used to have. And so there may be friends who sort of may not be greatest friends anymore after this, and vice versa, right? So people sort of, changing individually and then just figuring out who they best connect with now after sort of being isolated for a long period of time from each other. So I can see it happening for a variety of reasons. I can also see it just not really changing much at all, that some of our group loyalties are just going to sort of try to go back to normal. We'll see. Well, it's a very interesting question. I really hope that there's a bunch of people out there trying to collect data on that right now, of just trying to see where people are and see how people are changing. Because this is sort of an interesting little natural experiment that I don't think we're going to get to see or I hope we don't get to see for quite a while.
Well, that's because it is kind of crazy. I think everyone's probably maxed out their Netflix account, but now we're forcing ourselves to watch things we normally wouldn't watch. And then we're finding interests that I don't think I didn't realize, because everyone's like, oh, I don't get influenced by a group. I'm in my own individual. And then you spend so much time by yourself, and then you realize you pick up old hobbies that you gave up for whatever reason that you forgot. I loved, why did I give this up? And you're like, oh, it wasn't accepted in whatever social group back in middle school, or you just find something new that you would never have come across because we are influenced by social groups. And I find that fascinating.
Yeah. So I guess just one little thing that I'll add to that is that you mentioned that we feel like we're not influenced by groups or things like that. And we as a species are definitely biased to believe that we are making our own decisions. We quite often are not. We quite often do not know why we are making certain decisions. And when we're even asked about why we made those decisions, we don't actually come to the correct answer. So we've done a variety of studies in social psychology that show that people will make decisions that we know were for certain reasons based off of the group context that they were in. We knew they made those decisions because similar people did not make those decisions in other groups. And when told that you made this decision, they often point to other reasons other than the reason that was manipulated by the experimenter. And so we know this to be the truth, and yet we continue as a species to believe that we are making our own decisions and that we are making those decisions without influence from other people. And so I think it's important that we don't have to, but at least when we're looking at the literature, to realize that, okay, these groups really do have an impact on us, and we're going to change and find different things based off of who's and what is influencing us. Kind of what we talked about at the beginning, right? There's a variety of things on the internet that are influencing us in a variety of different ways, and people are trying to figure that out in order to maximize interaction with those different platforms. And, are those having a larger effect on us now because the other groups that have substantial influence on us are no longer sort of pushing us forward? Probably.
Well, that's the scary thing about the algorithms, the internet algorithms, when it comes to advertising, how you look up one thing on Amazon and next thing you go on Instagram the next day and there's an ad for either that product or a similar product because or if you look at it, you don't recognize the product, you go back on Amazon, the thing you looked at, things people also look into, and it's a little creepy. If no one knows what I'm talking about, go on your Amazon account and go search something that you've never seen before, you just never would care. Just look up unicorn slippers or something, and I guarantee you're going to see advertisements for unicorn slippers somewhere on your social media. And it's kind of frightening because it does show that before you notice it, how many times did you click on an advertisement because they force fed it to you, and it's a little creepy.
Yeah, and so one of the interesting questions about that, right, is when it comes to these algorithms, right, that we're using huge data sets to determine and try to predict outcomes. If this person's interested in this, they're also likely to be interested in this because we've seen that just across the board. And these algorithms get very, very complex with billions and billions of data points, if not trillions. These algorithms have no understanding as to why this is the case. And, as a social psychologist, right, that's what we want to figure out, why are these things connected? What's very interesting is, we quite often take this approach of, okay, it's predicting what we want and those kind of things. But there's also the other side of the coin, is that it's also trying to influence you to buy these things at the same time. And so it's not necessarily it's trying to predict you and oh, I wanted that. It's also trying to predict how to convince you to want that at the same time. And so it's a variety of things all coming together, of trying to influence people, trying to influence behavior, trying to influence their identities, while trying to make the maximum amount of profit, but not actually understanding why all of those individual things happen. And so it's our job as social psychologists to actually figure out, okay, well, why is this happening? Why is behavior engaged this way? And they're just trying to aggregate the data and make content that's profitable for them.
It's also scary too, because advertising also comes straight into politics, which I found I didn't realize this until I was talking to other friends. because one of my friends was like kind of happy the election was over because like they were getting tired of seeing Joe Biden commercials, like when they watch YouTube and stuff. And I thought about it, like the entire time I'm on YouTube, I've never seen a Joe Biden or Harris commercial. I've seen 1,000 Trump commercials. But then I looked into my research. Like a lot of the stuff when I watch videos, it's like stuff about firearm history or war history, or like I was doing research for my dissertation, which was on veteran perspectives of torture, and my books that are mine were based on military history, torture, and all this other stuff. And I guess they were seeing that and they're like, this guy must be voting this particular way. But it's just interesting. Like, it's strange for me to think about like that because of a few choices when I was doing research and looking at things, YouTube only fed me one side of a political debate. Like, obviously I'm looking up and getting my own research, but if people that only rely on suggestions, which I'm sure there are people that are out there, and that's kind of a terrifying thing to think about when you live in a democracy.
Yeah, I mean, the algorithms are very adept because they have so many data points at figuring out what content to sort of send to you. And these political parties and advertising agencies or whatever it is, they're trying to figure out what's the best way to convince you to do this, right? And if it's voting or buy their product or donate to a particular cause or even just have a particular attitude to be mad about, right? Whatever it is, they're going to get the right people that information to maximize whatever that bottom line is. And the reality is when you have a lot of data points, you can do that. It's very easy to do that. And I mean, like, so I'm registered as an independent, right? And I, interestingly enough, never got a single call anytime from one side of the political aisle, right? But I got so many calls over and over again to ensure that I was voting from the other political party. And this was clearly intentional, but they were clearly scared because I wasn't necessarily part of their group, that they wanted to make sure that I would vote their way. And no matter how many times I told them that they didn't have to worry about me, that I was voting this particular way, and I was in agreement with them, they continued to try to pursue that because, again, I wasn't sort of part of their group and they didn't have, I guess, the metrics to believe that I was that particular person. And so, you have all of these ways to try to predict things, but when it comes down to it, right, there's still a human factor there. People are still going to believe things one way or the other and be convinced by things. And so it's a very interesting sort of dynamic, and I hope we are able to figure it out eventually as social psychologists.
Well, it's funny you talk about that. I didn't get any phone calls this year because I don't have an American phone number, so I don't think they're going to think to call a British number.
Yeah.
But it is interesting. Like, I was thinking back to 2016 when Trump ran for the first time. I did get a few Trump notifications, but it wasn't ever from Trump. It was from the NRA, even though I was never a member of one. But I guess they got my information from something, and they're like, and it isn't like that is kind of a strange thing. Who calls you and what organizations call you and which? Oh, there's so much there. But I was going to ask. This is my second to last question. Do you predict any interesting developments in social or anything like that coming to the future after this election and after COVID-19? And
so our field is a very broad field. We have our fingers in a lot of pots. So psychology just as a whole is very broad. Social psychology is sort of a different perspective on a lot of the psychological concepts. And so if you think of psychology as really just trying to understand how the mind and behavior work, social psychology is really how the mind and behavior work in the context of a group. And then you have social psychology, which is just trying to figure out what the group is doing. Not social psychology, sociology. This is trying to figure out
which is more my field,
right? And so you have varying ways of examining things. And so social psychology really does examine all of those different things just from that perspective. And so you think of social psychology as, group dynamics and a lot of like famous studies within social psychology of, putting people in a room, seeing how they interact with each other and those kind of things. But the reality is our field is definitely moving in the same direction that the rest of psychology is moving, right? Trying to understand the neurobiological underpinnings of things, but also at the same time trying to understand sort of very cognitive things as well, given the advent of our understanding of how computer processes work. So how our field is going and where our field is going is definitely headed in that direction of trying sort of taking the more modern technology that we have to examine the mind and behavior and trying to understand those kind of things. And so is it trying to understand how different inputs into the brain result in different responses? I definitely think that will be an aspect of where we go in the future. I think the influx of a huge amount of data from the internet will definitely also dramatically influence how we envision a lot of these things. And so where do I think our field is going? I think it's, it could go anywhere right now. And I just hope that we make some of the right decisions in making sure that we examine those things the right way and we don't accidentally head down the wrong path. It's a dead end. And that's, I don't know if that really answers that question, but I see us going in a lot of different directions, and I don't know what's wrong and I don't know what's right. And I hope that we make the right decisions along the way.
Well, I think you answered the question, because now I have a million more questions, but it just sounds, man, that does sound like a lot of potential for ethical issues down the future. But it is an interesting analogy where people think of psychology, or when I talk to people about when there's social psychology, people think there's only sociology or psychology. They don't think there's a middle ground, which I'm not sure if you guys are kind of.
I would argue that it's sociology and psychology are two non-overlapping circles, and social psychology is a separate field that tends to have the word psychology in it. That is the circle in the middle that overlaps with both to some extent.
And that's the thing. You don't think about that, but also people, when you talk about the algorithms, and like, I didn't know Facebook hired the most psychologists ever, but after you said that, I'm like, that makes total sense. Like, it's one of the,
that's also that we know of. It's possible that a government agency is hiring far more social psychologists somewhere, but Facebook definitely is the prime hirer of us right now.
Yeah, don't try and say that too loudly. The government will come after you.
Hey, so at our national conference, the biggest social psychology conference, they have a booth, and the purpose of that booth is to recruit social psychologists. The CIA and other tech companies and all kinds of vendors are there because, you know, if they're trying to understand human behavior, social psychology, it tends to be one of those areas that's going to at least understand how those group interactions work.
Yeah, and it's a really interesting thing. A lot of people don't understand when it comes to criminal justice. Is like, when I got my degree in criminal justice, I was like, okay, I'm a veteran, I'm a criminal justice degree, I'm going to get a job with the FBI. I'm a dime a dozen. I'm just a trigger finger with a degree, but they want people like you, and they want lawyers, and they want the computer scientists. So I'm happy to see that the field's starting to get the respect that it deserves, but it's still, a lot of people don't understand psychology, or they get kind of freaked out with people examining their minds.
Yeah, I mean, if anyone's worried about that, I mean, social psychology is definitely not that field of psychology. It's the field of psychology that is really just trying to understand human behavior and trying to understand it within this group context. We're not trying to analyze people. We're not trying to treat people. We're not trying to, you know, I always get that question, right? Like, are you analyzing me right now? And it's like, no, I'm not. If anything, I'm more likely to be analyzing my own behavior in this group context or examining the group context. I'm not trying to figure out, this person has this personality trait, so they're going to act this way. And yet that's usually how, you know, psychologists are treated by the layperson. And the reality is we're not doing that. We may be fascinated by particular behavior, but we're definitely not trying to analyze you or trying to figure something out about you.
But it's also the same point, like, human behaviors, we're always analyzing everything. Like, that's
so a separate sort of argument that sometimes I make with my students is that I believe that social psychology is a very desirable field by a lot of people. Surprisingly, I think a lot of people would actually be interested in it because there's certain aspects of social psychology that are innately human, right? We're all trying to figure out our group and how our group interacts with each other and how we can predict each other's behaviors. And that is, I believe, extremely human. And that's exactly what social psychologists are trying to do. We're just trying to make a career out of it.
Which I find it strange, just looking back into criminal justice. Like, Massachusetts criminal justice field is pretty progressive because it forces you have to take a couple psychology fields and a couple sociology fields to get you ready to get into criminology, which is basically sociology and psychology of criminals. But we never took a social psychology course. And like, looking back on like human interactions and like a lot of the issues we have with law enforcement in the States, it sounds like that would have been a very effective tool for them to have.
So quite frequently, a lot of the stuff that is discussed within social psychology sort of spills over into other fields. You know, a lot of the very famous studies within social psychology are often taught in non-social psychology classes, sometimes in a way that makes it sound like they're the ones who did it and not us. But you know, you probably have learned quite a lot of these ideas. It's just a matter of how much have you delved in and how much depth you've gone into a lot of the ideas within social psychology.
And I think that's the scary thing about psychology, and I learned with human rights, is probably one of those fields. The more you learn, the more you know you don't know.
Oh, definitely. So for those of you who don't know out there, when you complete a doctorate, a particular PhD in a research realm, you usually have to complete a comprehensive exam. And that comprehensive exam takes a lot of different forms, but it usually involves learning a lot about a particular area and them testing you and your ability to regurgitate and fully understand and grasp those concepts. And so my comps I did during the summer between my second and third year of graduate school, and it was a lot of reading, somewhere in the neighborhood of 25,000 pages, 2,500 pages, I'm sorry. And
let's say 25,000 pages, like you're
yeah,
finding
it was
Martin on that.
Thankfully it wasn't, but 2,500 pages of, journal articles, which are not easy to get through. Then I was stuck in a room for 8 hours and asked to regurgitate all that information. As you go through those things and coming out of that particular process, right, it really, you realize that like, wow, I don't know anything, but now I understand at least the language of this particular subdiscipline, and I can start to have those conversations to actually figure out those things. And it wasn't until that point, right, where I had a degree in psychology from my undergraduate institution. I had completed a master's thesis at this point, and it wasn't really at that until I had completed that I at least felt that I spoke the language. And yet still today, right, I don't know everything, right? And it's a constant learning to try to figure out all of these different things of the thing that I'm trying to study. But at least I can speak the language and I can pursue that now.
I think the most interesting thing after completing a master's is I have a higher respect for like those professors that I kind of thought where like you'd ask them a question and they'd like think for a while and they're like trying to think. You think they're taking like a dramatic pause and they're showing you, but the truth is like I've learned, I just ask them a question and they're trying to figure out like I'm wrong in 100 ways, right in 50 ways, but like how do I best answer this question?
Yes, and so like even things that I've said today, right, that I'm sure there's a nuance that I missed somewhere because there's so much nuance to each individual aspect of how we do these things, and I tried to convey as much of that, but quite frequently there's so much nuance that you say one thing different in a question. How do I answer that question without being right or wrong, without also confusing you at the same time? As an educator, we're constantly trying to figure those things out.
I know people are going to have issues with some of the examples I use trying to explain about social groups and like the journeys and stuff like that. People are going to have issues, but I have to be aware of my issues and you just have to learn, but it's just so complicated when you're talking about these subjects that it's like, and also I'm finding the English language to be a lot more limiting than I ever noticed it to be.
Yeah.
But we're coming up to the end of the time. I was going to ask, is there any final statement that you wanted to make or?
No, I mean, just in general, I think it's important that we try to examine human behavior, right? Human behavior is something that we're, as a species, I think, very fascinated by it. And it's a very complex thing, and there's a lot that goes into it. And some of those things are positive, some of those things are negative, and we really do need to examine those things carefully and closely and not jump to conclusions about things, and not jump to conclusions about other people because of some of the things that we may have learned about. Right? Just because someone does something one way doesn't mean it's because of this particular phenomenon or that particular phenomenon. But it's really a question that we need to examine. And that's what social psychology as a science sort of tries to do. And that's what I hope a lot of you got out of this conversation.
I wish we could get more into it, but you make a good point also about jumping to biases. I've learned moving across like overseas and living like talking to other people of other cultures. People will make a statement about something, and then I have a bias just based on my growth. It's not a bad thing to have a bias right away. It's a bad thing not to be aware of it and not acknowledge it and try to explore, because some biases we just learn from family members or friends or media, and we have no idea where that bias came from.
And people have to realize that the same biases that may make you a racist that are definitely detrimental to society are also sometimes the same biases that make you scared of heights, and that might be very useful to keeping you alive. So, there's lots of things that have positives and negatives. Being able to use those and understand that human behavior is really what social psychology tries to do, what psychology tries to do, what I think a lot of the conversations that people are having about behaviors and attitudes and their identities and politics are hopefully trying to do. The question is, can we have these conversations in a very open, productive way and not necessarily in a detrimental way?
Yeah, and just to clarify, because when you just said that real quick, what he meant by that about what can make a bias racist and what can do it, it's probably because it's back to a bad experience, not that it's inherently in our DNA or anything like that. That was just the way you said that. I just want to clarify real quick.
So I would say that the underlying mechanism is probably in our DNA at some level, but the actual bias that causes someone against one particular group or another is probably as a result of some kind of learned behavior from society.
Yeah, you see something as a danger and then you don't comprehend it correctly, and then you associate the wrong thing with the danger, and we're walking down dangerous territory there. No, but I did want to say thank you for being on the podcast. And before we go, if you enjoyed this podcast, which I hope you enjoyed this episode, please check out other episodes. We also have a website at rightsandwrongspodcast.com. If you enjoyed this podcast and would like to be on it or had any issues and like to throw another perspective, we do have article sections, which are usually from people like you, the listener. I try to keep my voice off there as little as possible. Or if you want to be on the podcast, just email me at rightsandwrongspodcast@gmail.com. We also, if you want to help support, it's not free running a podcast. We do have a donation page. I do have a Patreon, which has some perks. And if you go in the shop, you can even pick up some cool things like a mug, stickers, and even a hat. But I did want to say thank you for listening, and thank you, Dr. Hatvany, for being on this podcast.
Great. Thanks for having me.